If I were young again and had to build wealth from almost nothing, I would not begin by looking for the smartest looking business in the room. I would begin by looking for the dullest useful business in town. That sounds backward to most people. The public is trained to admire whatever sounds modern, difficult, and exciting: artificial intelligence, apps, venture-backed platforms, anything with a new acronym and a founder who speaks too fast. I have made a very good living ignoring most of that noise. I do not dislike progress. I dislike paying too much for stories, and I especially dislike the modern habit of confusing glamour with economics. A business does not become better because it sounds sophisticated. Very often the opposite is true. The more a business needs a beautiful story, the less I trust it. The businesses I have respected most over a lifetime usually had three traits. People needed them, customers came back, and the economics could be made simpler, tighter, and more repeatable over time. That is why I have always had a weakness for boring businesses. A boring business is often just a business whose demand is real enough that nobody bothers turning it into entertainment. That is exactly the kind I like. People need filters, they need heating and air fixed, they need vehicles towed, they need trash removed, they need equipment right now. When their own equipment fails, they need clean windows, they need laundry done. They need cash in certain places, even in a world pretending cash disappeared. That is not fantasy demand. That is recurring demand. Recurring demand is one of the most underrated assets in the world. If I were starting over today and I needed to build my first real stream of cash flow, I would not ask which business makes me sound impressive. I would ask which business quietly pays me month after month because the customer keeps coming back and the problem keeps recurring. That is the correct starting question. The public wants the giant outcome immediately. I want the dependable machine first. There are two broad families of cash flow businesses I would study. The first family is what I call property-oriented businesses. A machine, a unit, a piece of equipment, a location, something you place in the world and then earn from because it sits in the right place and stays useful. The second family is service businesses. Those are harder for some people to understand because they are built less on a thing and more on process, people, trust, and repetition. The first family often feels easier because the machine looks passive. The second family often scales better because systems can be replicated faster than heavy assets can be financed. That distinction matters. A lot of people want passive income when what they really need first is active understanding. I do not want someone buying a machine and calling himself a business owner when he has not yet learned what makes the machine productive. That is why I always start with economics before romance. Let me begin with the property-oriented side, because this is where many people first get seduced by the phrase cash flow. Take the ATM business. At first glance, it sounds too small to matter. A box in a nail salon, a box in a bar, a box in a convenience store. What could possibly be exciting about that? Nothing. That is part of the appeal. A person buys a machine, places it where cash is still useful, keeps it funded, makes sure it works, and collects a fee every time someone values immediate access more than the small charge. That is not revolutionary. It is a toll booth. I have always liked toll booths. The public loves grand strategy. I love toll booths. Now, the important thing here is not the machine itself. It is the location, the refill discipline, the maintenance, and the relationship with the venue. A bad location turns a machine into dead metal. A good location turns it into a very small employee working all month long. That is how I think about these things, not as gadgets. As labor, can this object, placed correctly, become labor that no longer depends on my body? That is the beginning of ownership. The mistake amateurs make is that they see one profitable ATM and imagine the business is simply buy more machines. No, the business is not the metal box. The business is the operating system behind the box. Can you keep cash in it? Can you maintain it? Can you negotiate the placement? Can you protect the economics? Can you scale the service side without letting the machine side embarrass you? That is what determines whether a person owns one decent ATM or a real local network. I always prefer people who start with one machine and one lesson before they move to 10 machines and 10 headaches. Scale without understanding is one of the oldest ways to go broke while feeling ambitious. Laundromats create the same fantasy in a slightly different costume. People love laundromats because they imagine a room full of machines swallowing quarters and card swipes while the owner sleeps. Sometimes there is a little truth in that. The public is always most vulnerable when there is a little truth. Yes, a laundromat can throw off recurring cash. Yes, customers come because clothes must be washed. Yes, there are neighborhoods where demand is stable enough that a well-run store can become a very good asset. But a laundromat is not passive in the way lazy imaginations want it to be. Machines break, floors get filthy. Customers judge convenience harshly. Water, power, rent, and labor still matter. And above all, location is fate. A laundromat in the wrong place is not a laundromat. It is a museum of broken assumptions. That is why I do not romanticize these things. I respect them. Respect is different from romance. A laundromat can be a wonderful starting point for someone who wants to learn recurring revenue, location economics, maintenance discipline, and operational systems. But I would never tell a young person to buy one because someone on the internet called it passive. Nothing serious is passive at the beginning. The owner has to become intelligent first. Only later do the systems begin doing enough work that the business starts to feel lighter. That is one of the great misunderstandings around wealth. People see the mature version and call it passive. They ignore the years of active learning it took to get there. Another property-oriented business I find especially interesting is equipment rental. Now this one is fascinating because it sits at the intersection of urgency and capital scarcity. A contractor, plant, warehouse, manufacturer, or builder often does not need a machine forever. He needs it now. That word now is where the margin lives. If a company can rent a compressor, generator, lift, pump, chiller, excavator, or specialty machine to keep operations moving, it will often pay a very high daily rate because the cost of waiting is even higher. That is how good businesses work. They do not only sell a product, they remove a more expensive pain. I have always believed that if you can remove a very expensive pain quickly, you can charge far more than someone who is merely offering a commodity. Rental equipment can do exactly that. The economics are beautiful when done well. You buy the asset once, you depreciate it, you maintain it, you place it. You collect rent repeatedly. If utilization is high and downtime controlled, the asset starts behaving like a little factory of cash. That is what interests me. The tax treatment can also be favorable, which is another sign that governments often reward capital ownership more generously than labor. People spend their whole lives angry about inequality without studying the incentives that keep creating it. Ownership is treated differently from wages. That is reality. Better to learn from it than complain at it. Still, the amateur mistake appears here too. He sees a good rental rate and imagines the whole game is buying equipment. No, the whole game is utilization, logistics, maintenance, relationships, and fleet discipline. A machine making nothing while sitting idle is not a productive asset. It is a financed hope. If I were entering rental, I would start as small as pride would allow. One asset class, one local network, one process for delivery, retrieval, upkeep, and billing. I would not let fantasy scale outrun operating competence. That is how people turn a good model into a fragile mess. Now here is the truth most people do not want to hear. As attractive as some property-oriented businesses can be, they often require more capital than beginners realize if they want to scale them meaningfully. Machines cost money, buildings cost money, repairs cost money. Expansion usually means more debt or more equity or both. That is why I often find service businesses even more attractive for a hungry beginner. A service business done properly can start with less money, learn faster, validate demand earlier, and scale through systems rather than just through assets. And when people hear service business, they usually underestimate how large those businesses can become. That is another mistake created by vanity. A person thinks a software company can scale. Of course, a person thinks a service company is a local hustle sometimes, but if the demand is recurring enough and the system is tight enough, a service business can become an empire disguised as ordinary work. HVAC is a beautiful example. Heating and air is not glamorous. Good. I do not want glamour. I want necessity. When systems break, people do not delay those decisions because the issue becomes physical immediately. It is too hot, too cold. The tenant is angry. The family cannot sleep. The restaurant cannot operate. The office becomes unbearable. Urgent need creates willingness to pay. Recurring maintenance creates recurring revenue. Emergency response, creates premium pricing. Replacement cycles create large tickets. This is not speculative demand. This is what I want. Now, the beauty of a service business like HVAC is not only that people need it, it is that a person can begin with skill rather than capital. That matters enormously. Trade school is not celebrated enough in modern America because too many people have been sold the fantasy that prestige education and white-collar ambiguity automatically outrank practical competence. I do not believe that. A man who can solve an urgent, costly problem with his hands and his judgment is in a much better position than a man who has learned to speak elegantly about industries he cannot actually serve. If I were young, had little capital, and wanted a path to serious wealth, I would look very hard at the trades, especially the ones attached to recurring necessity, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, roofing, critical maintenance. The reason is simple. You can learn a real skill, you can work for someone else while getting paid to study the economics. You can watch where jobs come from, you can learn what customers complain about, you can see what a bad operator looks like, you can understand dispatch, scheduling, margin, parts, sales, and service from the inside before risking much of your own money. That is a far more intelligent apprenticeship than many people realize. And when you finally begin your own operation, you are not guessing. You are solving known pain. That is a very different thing. The challenge in service is not demand. The challenge is standing out. That is where most people fail. They know the craft. I have seen that many times a talented technician is not automatically a competent owner. The owner must build systems. Answer the phone properly. Show up on time. Follow up, quote, clearly. Use digital channels intelligently. Train people. Measure performance. Keep quality high enough that reputation becomes a tailwind instead of a tax. Those are business disciplines, not craft disciplines. They can be learned, most never bother. That is why the opportunity exists. People ask me all the time where the inefficiency still lives in a world with so much competition. I tell them it lives where basic competence is still rare. That is still true in a shocking number of local service markets. You do not need to invent the future to win. Sometimes you only need to answer the phone, arrive when promised, charge fairly, market intelligently, and build systems in a field full of operators who treat professionalism as optional. That alone can create a fortune. Towing is another business that looks small from a distance, and enormous up close if you understand the economics. The public sees a tow truck and thinks of inconvenience. I see emergency infrastructure. That difference matters. The emergency towing business is one of the purest examples of urgency pricing in the real economy. If a car is stuck, the owner is annoyed. If a truck is down on a highway, the owner is bleeding money by the hour. That difference changes the whole margin structure. A light-duty tow is one thing. Heavy-duty towing and recovery is something else entirely. Once you are one of the few local operators with the equipment and skill to move expensive commercial vehicles under real-time pressure, you possess pricing power. Most people never notice from the road. Again, I like boring markets because they hide power from people who only study fashionable things. The owner of a heavy tow business in the right corridor may be sitting on one of the most attractive local monopolies in town and still be underestimated because his wealth is not wrapped in the language of venture capital. That is my favorite kind of wealth. The kind people misprice socially because they do not understand its economics. The challenge, again, is the same. The truck is not the business. The permits, drivers, maintenance, dispatch, discipline, insurance, response time, and relationship web are the business. A person who buys a truck without building the operating system is buying an expensive piece of optimism. A person who builds the system and then adds trucks is building an asset. That distinction is everything. Waste management fascinates me for similar reasons. It is one of the clearest examples of a business category most people ignore while using it constantly. Every home produces waste. Every business produces waste. Every city requires collection, transport, sorting, and disposal. There is nothing glamorous here. Excellent. Glamour would only attract more foolish competition. What matters in waste is routes, permits, density, customer contracts, local relationships, operating discipline, and when you scale enough, acquisition strategy. That is how a tiny local service can become a giant. People love to say that all big companies begin small. They say it in a sentimental way. I see it more practically. What matters is not that they began small. What matters is that they began specific. One route, one operating edge. Then they built from there. That is how you should think about any boring service opportunity. Do not begin by asking how big the national market is. Begin by asking what one clear unfair advantage can be built in one defined operating zone. That is how real businesses grow. Not from abstraction, from dominance in a narrow useful lane. Window cleaning is a perfect example of how small beginnings can deceive people. A bucket, a squeegee, soap. A man begins with what looks like almost nothing. The public sees no status in that. Good status blindness is where many fortunes hide. What matters is not the starting toolkit. What matters is the customer relationship, the repeatability, the referrals, the service standard, and the systems that later allow many crews to do consistently what one person once did manually. I have enormous respect for businesses that begin with almost no capital but large discipline. A person who can turn a simple local service into millions of dollars of profitable recurring work has demonstrated something far more durable than cleverness. He has demonstrated operating intelligence. Operating intelligence is one of the most powerful forms of intelligence in the world because it converts small, simple work into scalable results. The public is infatuated with idea intelligence. I like execution intelligence better. Ideas are cheap, operations are rare. Now, there are principles behind all of these examples that matter more than the examples themselves. That is where most people go wrong. They hear a story and try to copy the surface, buy an ATM, start a laundromat, buy a tow truck, launch an HVAC company. That is not how adults learn. Adults should extract the rule. The first rule is start lean. I cannot say this strongly enough. Most people make the mistake of trying to buy the final version of the business before they have proven the first version. That is vanity dressed as confidence. If you can validate demand with less risk, do it. If you can sell before building the full machine, do it. If you can broker, drop ship, subcontract, or pre-sell in a way that teaches you where demand lives before you commit all your capital, do it. People are often in love with the feeling of ownership before they have done the work of validation. That is how savings get buried in bad guesses. The second rule is get to revenue fast. I do not trust business plans that need applause before they need customers. The customer is the judge. Everything else is a rehearsal. A person who can get a few paying customers quickly has learned something priceless. The market is confirming that the pain is real enough to exchange money for relief. That is the beginning of business truth. Not the logo, not the website, not the pitch deck. Revenue. The third rule is local focus. This may be the most underrated advantage available to small operators today. The internet made people believe the whole world is their market from day one. That is often a mistake. A narrow local market served exceptionally well teaches you what broad ambition cannot. Who really buys, how quickly, why they say yes, why they complain, how they compare you, what actually matters in the service experience. Those lessons are much cheaper to learn locally than regionally or nationally. A person who cannot dominate a neighborhood has no business fantasizing about dominating a country. The fourth rule is build systems from pain. This is one reason I prefer founders who have done the work themselves. If you have answered the calls, loaded the truck, dealt with the angry customer, found the broken unit, missed the part, written the invoice, fixed the machine, and dealt with the messy middle, you know where the friction lives, then your systems can be built to attack real problems. A person who has never touched the pain often builds systems that look tidy on paper and collapse in reality. Pain is expensive. It is also educational. The fifth rule is understand that cash flow businesses become real wealth only when they stop depending entirely on your body. This is the turning point most people never reach. They own a job disguised as a business. Then they congratulate themselves for being independent while actually being more trapped than before. A true cash flow business must eventually be teachable, repeatable, measurable, and detachable from the founder's physical presence in at least some meaningful degree. Otherwise, you have not built an asset. You have built a demanding employer who wears your name tag that may still be worthwhile in the beginning. It is not the end goal. The goal is always to move labor into system. System into repetition, and repetition into an asset that can either be expanded, sold, borrowed against, or used to fund other ownership. That is what I mean when I say a boring business can make you rich. Not that the business itself is magical, that the path from hustle to system to ownership is available if you respect the boring enough to understand it deeply. There is another lesson buried in all this that I want to make very clear. The rich are not always the people who found the newest thing. Very often they are the people who found the oldest need and served it in a more disciplined way than everyone else around them. That is one of the great secrets in capitalism. People romanticize invention. I respect distribution, consistency, speed, and service just as much. A man who invents something marvelous can become rich. A man who simply answers a recurring pain better than anyone else in his market can also become rich. The second path is more common than the public realizes. It is just less glamorous to discuss. This is why I keep saying that the business world is full of hidden toll booths, small toll booths, local toll booths, industry-specific toll booths, each one attached to a recurring inconvenience, an urgent repair, a local necessity, or a routine problem. If you can own one, great. If you can build systems around several, better. If you can use the first to buy the second and the second to buy the third, now you begin understanding how real wealth compounds outside of stock certificates. I am not telling anyone this path is easy. It is not easy. The trucks break, the customers complain, the employees quit, the machines sit idle if you place them wrong, the permits get complicated, the cash gets tight, the systems fail before they work, the internet makes competitors appear overnight. Nothing serious is easy. I do not want easy. I want understandable. I want a business where effort, skill, systems, and time can create widening distance between the disciplined owner and the sloppy one. That is what these boring businesses offer. They are not easy. They are legible. And legibility is one of the greatest advantages in the world. If I understand what drives a business, I can improve it. I can compound it. If I can compound it, I can eventually turn something uncelebrated into something formidable. That is exactly what the public keeps missing. It wants a business that sounds like success from the first sentence. I want one that behaves like success by the 10th year. Those are not the same thing. A smart young person with little money but real discipline has a tremendous opening in boring businesses because so many others are looking the wrong direction. They want the startup lottery ticket, they want the app, they want the viral consumer brand, they want something people can admire instantly. Meanwhile, the person who is willing to understand filters, towing, HVAC, equipment rental, trash, cleaning, and all the other ungilded corners of the economy gets to study something else. Demand that does not need storytelling. That is a very attractive starting point. So, if I were young and starting again, I would ask 5 questions before touching any boring business. Is the demand recurring or urgent enough that the customer returns or pays quickly? Can I begin lean enough to validate without risking ruin? Can I dominate one local lane before chasing scale? Can I translate founder effort into a repeatable operating system? And if the system works, does this become an asset or only a harder job? If the answers are good, I would get to work. Not because the world would applaud, because the economics make sense. I have never needed the world to clap for a good business. I only need the business to keep producing. That is the difference between entertainment and ownership. Entertainment wants witnesses. Ownership wants cash flow. And if you understand that difference early enough, a very boring business can do something quite extraordinary. It can buy you back your future.